So today's talk is about economics, but also about politics, because it's about how we politically decide to run our economy. Who should be in charge? How should the economy work? What kind of input should ordinary people have? And that reminds me of an old story about a young boy asking his father, "Dad, what is politics?" And his father said, "Well, son, think of it this way. I'm the father, I'm the head of the household, I'm sort of the government. Your mother mostly does what I say, so she's like the people. The maid does all our chores, she's like the working class. And our baby represents the future." So the young boy was impressed and went off to bed, satisfied that he understood what politics was all about. In the middle of the night, he had to go to the toilet, so he got out of bed and crept along the corridor. And as he tiptoed past, he noticed that the baby had done a poo and was crying. Despite his cries, his mother remained asleep and undisturbed. Meanwhile, as he went further on the corridor, he peeked into the ajar door of the maid's room and found his father in bed with the maid. So the next morning, when he woke up at breakfast, his father said, "Well, did you understand what I said last night about politics?" And the young boy said, "Well, I think so. Politics is the government is screwing the working class, the people are fast asleep, and the future is in deep shit." And that sort of sums up, I think, where we are as a country. We have a gravely unjust, undemocratic economy, which is in contrast to our political system, which of course is far from perfect. The first past the post voting system means that people who vote for minority parties have no representation, or mostly no representation. But at least when it comes to political life, we do expect political democracy. So my argument is, why can't we also expect economic democracy as well? Why can't we overcome this gulf, this dissonance between the political system, where there's one person, one vote, and the economic system, where a handful of people have all the votes? To me, extending the economic franchise is a continuation of the battle of the Chartists and the suffragettes. It's about extending democracy into the economic realm. And it's a very simple idea. It would lay the foundations for a much more just, equitable, and constructive partnership between everyone who contributes to wealth creation and the provision of private and public services. Just for a moment, I ask you to pause and forget about the way society is and just imagine what it could be. Imagine an alternative society with genuine economic participation, democracy, accountability, transparency, and decentralization. I would argue that such a society would be much less prone to corporate irresponsibility, financial crisis, inequality, and alienation. We would have a very different kind of society where the economy and the way it was run was in closer alignment with the political system, and perhaps even better. In my view, a form of economic democracy is possible. We simply need to imagine it and then work to make it a reality. All it takes is our will and our vision, our creativity, to envisage a new and different kind of economy. So, if we look at our current economic system, we can say that in broad terms it is a form of economic dictatorship, characterized by the absence of democracy, participation, transparency, and accountability. Employees, whether in the private sector or the public sector, are largely frozen out of economic influence and decision making. In the existing system, which too many people take for granted and assume is inevitable, big business rules, and everybody else has in effect no meaningful say. So the leaders of industry, commerce and finance have almost total power. They run their businesses on quasi-totalitarian lines. If you think about it, all the key levers of decision making in the economy are in the hands of a tiny, privileged elite of major shareholders, directors and managers. They may have a role to play, but should they have such a preponderant power? Should they have almost exclusive power in the way in which the economy and individual enterprises and services are run? So if we contrast the one person, one vote principle that characterizes our political system, in our economic system, the corporate top brass have all the votes. They alone determine how companies and public institutions operate. Employees without whom no wealth would be created and no institution could function are powerless and disenfranchised. The shop floor worker, the nurse, the receptionist, the people who contribute to a system, the way it operates, they have no meaningful say at all. So these then are the flaws of the existing economic regime. The point is, what could or should or may constitute an alternative? Now, I would not pretend for one moment to have all the answers. I haven't got a blueprint. But what I would suggest is some fragments of ideas which point the way in which a more democratic economy might look or might operate. And I'm sure there are greater minds than mine that can finesse the details, or perhaps come up with a whole new set of ideas. But the important thing is that we have a conversation, a discussion, a debate, and actually recognise this is a legitimate area for public contention. That we should not simply accept the economy as it is, but we should have the imagination to dream of what the economy could be. So what I'm about to propose is not a future economic system per se, but perhaps fragments or an embryo of what economic democracy might involve, of how we might make a transition from where we are now to where we might get to at some point in the future. So what I want to propose today are 4 basic ideas. And the first one is the idea of having a check and a balance on the abuse of economic power. We're all familiar with the financial meltdown of a few years back. One of the reasons it happened was because economic power was concentrated in such tiny hands, and those tiny hands were able to take decisions which had devastating impacts not only on their institutions but the whole economy and the whole population. So one important check and balance on the abuse of economic power would be to make corporate negligence, recklessness and irresponsibility an explicit criminal offence. At the moment, if you or I do something wrong, we can be held liable in law. we can be prosecuted. But for the most part, if people who hold corporate economic power do wrong, they can get away with it scot-free. How many bankers went to jail? None. I don't think that the heads of financial institutions or company bosses should be able to wreck whole economies and squander people's jobs, pensions and savings with impunity. I think they ought to be personally held accountable for damaging corporate decisions. In the same way that doctors, solicitors and other professionals can be held liable for negligence. So if a doctor does a negligent decision, he or she can be taken before the General Medical Council, can be disciplined, struck off, they can be sued. No such penalties apply to the major shareholders and directors who are implicated in economic and financial wrongdoing. I would say that if there was a criminal offence of corporate negligence, if there were the threat of personal legal penalties, including personal financial payback and possibly, in severe instances, prison, that would be likely to result in much more prudent corporate governance. Just think about it. If we'd had a criminal offence of corporate recklessness and negligence, say 10 or 15 years ago, I doubt the directors of RBS or Northern Rock would have taken the reckless decisions they did. If they knew that they could be personally liable for the financial consequences and face the possibility of prison, they would have not played fast and loose with our money. They would not have pushed our whole economy to the precipice of a new Great Depression. I think that having that safeguard is a fundamental to ensuring that we don't have a repeat of 2007-2008. It would result in wiser corporate decision making. The second idea I'd like to propose is the requirement that all medium and large-sized companies and public institutions like local councils and the National Health Service should be required by law to have on their management boards 1/3 employee elected directors and independent directors appointed to represent the interests of consumers. Now, as you know, there is a version of this, a watered down version of this in Germany called the Works Council, where employees are represented on the management boards. And I think overall, although it's not as strong and as comprehensive as what I would suggest, overall it has led to better industrial relations and through that better productivity in Germany than we have in Britain. Now, the employers in Germany are very happy with the Works Council decision. They think it works. They think it's beneficial to employees and beneficial for their companies. Perhaps they wouldn't like it if they had to have 1/3 employee directors and independent consumer directors, but under the current system, I think there's something to it that we could learn from. I think it would incline a workplace to greater fairness and to more harmonious industrial relations, because having workers on the board and having consumer input, you'd be more likely to iron out problems before it got to a strike situation. You'd be more likely to iron out problems before you had products released on the market that were dangerous or socially and environmentally damaging. I think it would result in employees feeling they had a greater stake in the institution for which they worked, and that would have improvements in productivity, which is good for the economy. So in a sense, everyone gains. And of course, not being solely driven by the profit motive, unlike the major shareholders and directors and top management, employee and consumer directors could probably be more inclined to push for workplace policies that are more socially inclusive, more just, more fair, more respectful of local environment and community, more socially inclusive. They could also, of course, act as whistleblowers, act as watchdogs against corporate irresponsibility, and so therefore help prevent the implementation of harmful boardroom decisions. So again, if there had been employee and consumer representatives on the boards of RBS and Northern Rock way back 10 years ago, they would have been privy to the decisions of the top brass, and they could have, if they'd recognised the dangers imposed by those investment decisions, they could have blown the whistle, they could have given a warning which may have prevented those decisions being implemented, or at least fully implemented, and therefore saved those two banks and the knock-on effect they had on the wider economy. The next idea I propose is to break up the unhealthy centralisation and concentration of economic power, the idea that employee mutual societies should be established to give their members control of their pension funds. This would decentralise, diversify and democratise investment decision making, to give it a stronger social dimension. As you probably know, around £900 billion is invested in UK pension funds, which accounts for roughly 1/3 of the entire stock market. So a huge swathe of investment money. And if that money was controlled by employee mutual societies, rather than by big corporate financial institutions, I think that would give a useful counterweight to the economic clout of big business. Now, of course, the employee mutual societies would appoint financial experts to run their pension funds, but they'd run them within a framework of parameters decided by the employees. So the employees may decide, we don't want to invest in nuclear power, we don't want to invest in sweatshops or the arms industry, we want to invest locally to boost the local economy and not send all the money down to London or across to South America or wherever. So I think that this kind of devolution of power to employees in private enterprises would help create a more diversified, decentralised investment process and help counterbalance the investment bias towards London and the South East. It would therefore enable employees to rebalance and invest in local economies which are often neglected and underfunded. I suppose also that employee-controlled pension funds might be more inclined to invest in ways that made their investment more people-centred, more environmentally aware, more focused on the social justice implications, more public welfare oriented. No guarantee, I agree, but I think when people are faced with the consequences of an investment decision, they think of their families, they think of their local communities, they think of their co-workers, they think of the region, the area in which they live. They want to better where they are. They don't just think, let's just chase the fastest, quickest buck, wherever it may be. The final idea I'd like to share with you is the idea that another way to devolve and democratise economic power would be to have a mechanism for employee share ownership, collectively held and administered on behalf of all the staff through employee mutual societies. A bit like the John Lewis model, but a bit stronger and a bit more powerful and effective. It would be run by the employees through a mutual society, not run by the John Lewis directors or their equivalent. Under this proposal, which was first promoted by the Swedish economist Rudolf Meidner in the 1970s, private share capital companies would be obliged to assign to these employee mutual societies a proportion of their annual profits in the form of new share issue. So the idea was that if a company increased its productivity, if it increased its profits, then the employees should, as a legal right, share the benefits. And they should share them collectively as a group, since they all contribute to it, and then they can make the decision about how they use those shares. The great strength of this scheme is not only its democratic and social justice elements, it also incentivizes and rewards employees for economic success. It says to employees, if you make a contribution, if you help this company operate better, it isn't going to be just taken in terms of bonuses for the top corporate people or the major shareholders. You're going to get benefits as well. So the more profitable and productive a company is, the more shares it would be required to issue to the employee mutual societies, and the sooner they would gain through this mechanism a significant boardroom influence as share owners. So over time, collectively and cumulatively, employees would gain a growing number of shares in the company they worked for, and therefore have voting rights over those companies. And I think that, that is a social justice argument, but it's also an incentive for employees to be mindful of productivity, which would benefit them, their companies, their firms, indeed the whole economy. It's a win-win for everyone. If companies operate on a more effective basis, if employees genuinely feel they've got a stake in their company, they're going to get benefits from it, then they will work to make those companies successful, and the company will be successful, and so will the whole economy. So it's a win-win for everyone. Now, as well as redistributing economic power in favour of employees and the wider public, these four ideas would create the elements of a new system of economic governance, and I believe put in place checks and balances to reduce the likelihood of a rerun of the economic crisis since 2007-2008. It would do this by a combination of decentralizing economic power, democratizing economic decision making, improving corporate social responsibility, and strengthening the transparency and accountability of businesses, both to their employees and to consumers. It would transcend or move beyond the elitist, concentrated, autocratic economic power that we currently have in our economy, and create a future society with more democratic, cooperative, and accountable elements. So my argument is, imagine, envisage, dream, and then work to make it happen. We need to have a public, national conversation, and we need a local one, where these ideas are discussed, where we can, as a community, whether nationally or locally, think about what up to now has largely been unthinkable. And the problem is, the three major parties won't think about these issues. They dare not. But we have to change that. We have to be mindful that there are parties, notably the Green Party, that is discussing these ideas, that says these ideas are important to be debated. And although they probably need refining, let's get in the experts to work out the details, to finesse the ideas and perhaps come up with new ones. But let's not just carry on as we've been doing for the last 40, 50, 100 years. That brought us to the brink of economic collapse in 2007, 2008. We can't have business as usual because the cyclical nature of free market capitalism will mean that we'll have a similar crisis again in the future if we don't change. Now, the other part of my talk today is, of course, to also challenge what logically flows from all of this, which is about alternatives to austerity. We are told by the current government, with the effective support of the leadership of the Labour Party, although many Labour members disagree, that there is no alternative, that austerity is inevitable. And it's true that Labour would not cut as hard and as deep and as fast, but they're committed to basically the same basic fundamental that we have to cut back to plug the deficit. Now, I think this is one of the greatest post-war cons ever perpetrated on the British people. There are lots of ways that we can plug the deficit without any need to cut vital public services and jobs. And I just want to share just a few very simple ideas. The first one I think everybody knows, we don't need to renew the Trident nuclear missile program. Apart from the fact that it is collusion with a violation of international law, that nuclear weapons and nuclear war would be horrendous war crime and crime against humanity. Apart from that, it will cost in the region of £100 billion over the 40-year lifetime of those renewed submarines and missiles. So if we scrapped the Trident nuclear missile program, which is not real, genuine, effective defence, that won't help us deal with the crisis in Syria and Iraq today. If we scrap the Trident nuclear missile program, we could save £100 billion over a 40-year period. Another option would be, of course, to end pension tax relief on people earning more than £150,000 a year. People with that kind of income do not need the tax break of pension tax relief. They're quite well off. They can manage without it. And if we ended pension tax relief on people earning more than £150,000 a year, we would bring in, or save, an extra 20 to 30 billion pounds a year. 20 to 30 billion pounds every year. If we closed the tax avoidance loopholes exploited by companies like Boots, Amazon, and so on, again we could bring in an extra 20 to 30 billion pounds a year. 20 to 30 billion pounds every year. And then if we introduced a financial transaction tax, not just on currencies but also on bonds, shares and commodities, if we set that tax at 0.05%, which is 1/20th of 1%, that would bring in every year in the region of 80 to 100 billion pounds. 80 to 100 billion pounds every year. And it would have the added benefit of dampening speculation. Speculators who gamble on currency movements and commodity prices and so on, they operate often at very fine margins. And although it's only 0.05%, that would be a disincentive for speculation. Speculation is very bad and damaging to the economy. So it would reduce speculation as well. So a very, very good positive outcome on two scores. And the final idea is the proposal to introduce a wealth tax on the richest 10% of the British population. The top richest 10% in Britain today have a combined personal wealth of £4 million pounds. £4 trillion. Staggering sum. That's more than double the entire GDP. these are people with enormous, fabulous wealth. At the upper end, they've got multiple homes in countries around the world, private yachts and jets, great art collections. I would suggest a one-off, not every year, but a one-off 20% wealth tax on the richest 10%. A graduated 20%. So at the bottom end, people may only pay 1 or 2%. But at the top end, they may pay 25 or 30%. But the average would be around about 20%. That would raise £800 billion. 800 billion. These figures are eye-watering. Now, to meet their wealth tax, the rich wouldn't have to wander around in sackcloth and ashes. They can still keep some of their luxury homes. They might have to sell one, sell the house in the south of France and Miami, perhaps give up a couple of their luxury cars, maybe sell off a couple of their Jackson Pollock paintings. It's doable. It's doable. They'll still be incredibly rich. Their lifestyles won't change significantly. They'll carry on as before. But they'll make a contribution which will enable a government to reboot and rebalance the economy. Now, for me, the very rich have to ask themselves a question. Do they love this country or not? Are they prepared to make some small sacrifice, small in their terms, to help get us out of this financial mess? If they're not, we have to question their patriotism. If someone loves this country, they will make sacrifices. We saw it during the Second World War. Churchill and others made an appeal to the rich to give up some of their wealth for the war effort. And many of them did. And that's how we built all those Spitfires and all those other, armaments we needed to fight and defend our country from Nazism. Well, as Vince Cable said, a couple of years ago, the economic crisis we've been through, at a certain point, was analogous to the crisis of war. Because if the economy had gone over the edge, we would have been in a new Great Depression. We came very close to all the banks going in a domino effect, which would have meant people losing their life savings, losing their homes, losing their jobs. I don't think most people realise just how close we came to catastrophe. So, as what we know, the Green Party has embraced this wealth tax policy. It is saying it should be targeted at the richest, 1%, and should be a levy, of 1 to 3% per year. So that's another version which I think deserves consideration and ought to be debated and discussed. And again, the details can be worked out later. But the important thing is that with this money, let's say with my version, the 20% average wealth tax one-off, with that £800 billion, we could use that to fundamentally rejig and rebuild the economy for a sustainable future. We could implement the Green New Deal. For those who don't know, the Green New Deal, the idea is that we invest in energy conservation and renewable energy to create energy security. We know with what Russia is doing now, the idea of relying upon Russia or other tyrannical regimes for oil and gas, including Saudi Arabia, which we rely upon far too much, that is damaging and threatening to our own national security. We need to build our own energy security base. We know that a serious program of energy conservation in homes, factories and offices could cut our energy requirements by 30%. Or if you're really pessimistic, by 20%. But cutting our energy needs by 20% means that, contrary to what the government says and what Labour is chiming in with, we don't need new nuclear power stations to plug the gap. We need renewable energy And renewable energy will come on much faster than a nuclear power station. A nuclear power station is going to be like 20, 25 years ahead from now, even if we agree it today. Renewable energy in terms of solar, wind, wave and tidal can be brought on stream much quicker. We look at Germany and they're far, far ahead of us in terms of solar energy. Far, far, far ahead. I can't remember exactly, I think it's nearly 20% of Germany's energy needs are now met from solar. The idea that because we're in the northern hemisphere and so far north we can't provide solar energy is nonsense. Germany proves it. The other big thing about the energy conservation program is that we create tens of thousands of low-skilled and unskilled jobs. Some skilled jobs as well. So a mixture of skilled, unskilled and semi-skilled jobs in terms of double glazing, loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, draft proofing, all those kinds of things. They're easy, quick job creation ways, methods. So that is a way in which we can get people off the dole, so we don't have to pay them, benefits. They earn money, they got their self-respect back, and they're paying tax, and they're paying national insurance. It's obvious, isn't it? What madness do we have where we have so many people unemployed, wasting their lives and their skills, when we pay them benefits to do nothing? It doesn't make economic sense. So the Green New Deal could, fund all these new job opportunities, bring them on stream quite quickly, guarantee energy self-sufficiency or near to. And you'd have money left over to plug the deficit. So, to me, the idea of a wealth tax, at least a one-off wealth tax, is obvious and very, very necessary. It is essential if we are to get ourselves out of the rut which we've been in for a long, long time and start to rebalance and rebuild the economy. Why aren't these ideas being more openly discussed? I'm a strong supporter of trade unions. Trade unions have fought for the rights of employees over many, many decades, and many of the rights that people in work have today are thanks to trade unions. We don't have kids working in factories, people working 12-hour days, no holiday pay, etc. We have all these rights for people in work thanks to the efforts over many generations of trade unions. But I tear my hair out in despair at the fact that the trade unions, with all the money and resources they've got, are not making these arguments. They're not setting out the case for these alternatives, neither for economic democracy nor for these alternatives to austerity. It's all very well and right and proper that the trade unions and others should criticise the Condemn Coalition and the policies they pursue. But criticism is not enough. To win, you have to have practical, realisable, constructive alternatives. What I've tried to do today is lay out a few of them. A few of them which the Green Party, are virtually alone of all the political parties, is discussing and proposing. But we need more people. More people in more positions in different parts of society speaking out. The trade unions are still, for the most part, very strongly wedded to Labour. I can understand the historic reasons for that. And despite my criticism of Labour, there are many good people in the Labour Party who genuinely still want and believe in social justice and a better society. But the way the leadership of the party has gone over the last 2 decades, it's far, far removed from Labour ideals. What the Green Party has done is pick up those ideals and carry them forward with a new green framework of a sustainable economy, to create a society and a planet where we and future generations can live and survive and prosper, where there's greater justice, greater equity, greater fairness. And I just hope that at some point the trade unions will wake up to the fact that The Labour Party is not the only progressive force in society, and in fact is a much less progressive force than it once was. There are other parties like the Greens who actually stand for the values that trade unions stand for and Labour once stood for. I would appeal to people in the Labour Party, if you want to stay in the Labour Party and fight the good fight, I admire you and salute you, but I don't think you're going to succeed. Because even the party's democratic structures have been so gutted over recent years. In the old days, the party conference was supreme. The party members decided policy. Now it's all decided at the top. And there's the window dressing of the National Policy Forum. The party conference for Labour is now just a media event. This weekend the Green Party's meeting. The members of the Green Party decide the policy. Caroline Lucas or Natalie Bennett don't decide, it's the members who decide. And that's the difference. The Green Party is a grassroots democratic party, which Labour once was, but sadly is no more. So, whatever we view, wherever we stand, I think it's important that we do try and build a new coalition. And there is a space, I think, for a red-green coalition between people who are from traditional Labour and left perspectives and the Greens. We can and should come together to build an alliance, to articulate, campaign and work for these ideas. I'm really encouraged that in some areas the Labour Party and the Greens are working together. In other areas, sadly, Labour seems to be very arrogant that they are the party of social progress and no one else is important. That's really sad, because when we're divided, that's when we have the system as it is. That's when the system will remain as it is. We need to work together, have a conversation across parties. People in different parties need to be talking to each other, and where there is a common ground around these kind of ideas, we need to work together. And with the trade unions, with community and civic organisations in local communities, let's have this debate. Let's get talking. Let's for a moment perhaps forget about the party labels and the party barriers and just think that good people, including some Conservatives perhaps, and some Lib Dems, and some from other parties as well, let's all get together and talk about these ideas. Let's put them on the agenda so that the big three parties have to start addressing them. At the end of the day, we, the people, will decide. It's like, the people are asleep. I think the people in this country for a long time have been asleep. But I can also remember a period not so long ago when the people were not asleep. You think of Margaret Thatcher and the poll tax in the 1980s. This was Margaret Thatcher's flagship policy, the poll tax. She said it was not negotiable. She said the government would never ever give up the poll tax. Well, most people in this country saw the poll tax for what it was. A very unfair tax that levied the same tax on a very rich person and a very poor person. People were not prepared to stomach it. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in the streets. Hundreds of thousands of people either refused to pay or delayed their payment to frustrate the system. And in the end, the government was forced to back down. Margaret Thatcher, who said there is no alternative, there is no negotiation, the poll tax is here to stay, was forced to eat humble pie and scrap the poll tax. That was people power in its finest form. It shows the power of us, the people. When we are united and determined, we can change things. If we see injustice and we're not prepared to put up with it, if we work together, we have the power to force a U-turn, even from the most intransigent government, like Margaret Thatcher's government was. So I think that's the model or the lesson from history. When it comes to alternatives to austerity, and economic democracy, we the people have to have this debate, and if we agree that the system is wrong, we have to challenge and change it. We have to work together across party boundaries, across communities, across the whole country, to create a new consensus that a different way is possible, necessary and desirable. I'm really proud that the Green Party is talking about these ideas and proposing these ideas. I just wish that message would get out to other parties as well. Thank you. Use whatever means we can to help challenge that kind of ostentatious, extravagant, over-the-top, obscene wealth.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can counter corporate lobbying?
Wait.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can counter the corporate lobbying that underlines our democracy so much?
Well, of course, you're probably all familiar with the lobbying bill. It was ostensibly about that, but in fact impacted on legitimate, civic and NGO organisations far more harshly. I do think there needs to be much stronger strictures on access of corporate lobbyists to MPs and government ministers. And also, of course, there needs to be some countervailing lobbying to challenge and question what they are doing. But going back to what you said, one of the problems is the media has or large sections of the media has a very limited, narrow focus, and a lot of these issues are deemed to not be interesting, not be worthy. But at the end of the day, as the Daily Mirror used to show in its old days when it did real investigative journalism, even quite ordinary, uneducated people, ostensibly, were really engaged when the Mirror used to expose, corporate wrongdoing and injustice around the world. So I think it's completely false to suggest that people aren't interested. People are interested and feel very energized and angry when they see culpable wrongdoing that people get away with. So I haven't got an answer because, of course, even The Guardian, sometimes I despair of the way The Guardian ignores really important, significant human rights and social justice issues.